Beware, this video contains major spoilers and you should not watch it if you haven't completed the game yet. The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. One of the best received games over the last years, and possibly the first Legend of Zelda title that didn't get a lot of hatred for being different. In fact, it masters being different so well that no one really minds. Or at least most people don't. The large but yet open world hardly seems boring. There's always something different to do along with shrines, Koroks, stables, villages and enemy camps. This part was so well executed, some people would say it's perfect. However, Breath of the Wild is also lacking in one department: the story. While it isn't necessarily bad, as the game didn't evolve around the story in the first place, it could easily be discussed if it was a step back from the story in Skyward Sword. So let's hop in a minor lesson about storytelling. Usually, storytelling follows a model as it turned out to be the best practice for games and movies: the 3-act structure. This means that a game's story starts showing everything the way it normally is, followed by a big incident which brings the game to where it is at that point. Then the story builds up towards a certain goal as a plot twist turns up, tightening the atmosphere. When the showdown is reached, everything gets wrapped up rather quickly and the game or movie ends. Breath of the Wild is certainly and by far not the first game to not follow this concept. It was almost impossible to follow it regarding the situation and the story the player was placed in.
The pictures were a perfect solution on how to tell a deep and twisted story without having the player there all the time. This is where it builds up and falls apart. The player gets introduced to the current situation and his past only very vaguely. The cutscenes before entering the Divine Beasts make a good Act 1 in the model, as they are used to build up the relationship between the characters and the player. The fact that those champions are dead was meant to give the player a dark, strange, and sad feeling when solving the dungeons. This comes due to the fact that even though you will be clearing those dungeons, the champions will never come back to life. The underlying theme of each champions gives the characters the seasoning they needed in order to give them one last goodbye. So, where did it go wrong? Well, in a whole lot of places. The points I talked about before are good, but they could have been done better. So much better. The problem with Breath of the Wild is that it doesn't take the time it needs to introduce the player properly to the champions. Not only that, but the champions almost seem irrelevant. While this is explained in the story, there is no empathy for the champions. They seem generic, and their writing is almost stereotypical. The story pieces the player can find are all building up towards one great event: the rise of Calamity Ganon. And as we finally reach Calamity Ganon, the big turning point of our story, nothing happens. No plot twist, no climax, no big boom, nothing. Just a cutscene of the champions muttering almost meaningless lines, followed by a reward that the player probably didn't need at this point anyway.
The only cutscene that involves the champions getting into trouble is played before the player even knows about the champions, as Link talks to the king when obtaining the paraglider. This way the player cannot relate properly as this cutscene is played so early on. And as the game goes on, so many other cutscenes are played that this is usually forgotten at the point the player learns about who and what the champions are. But why would they do that? Well, this is rather simple to explain. The story of Breath of the Wild, you guessed it, is all about the past and remnants. So was there no way to bring in a climax? Well, yes there is. In fact, they had 1 billion opportunities but didn't use a single one properly. The only way they tried to bring this back was by showing the champions one last time as the player entered the Calamity Ganon fight, and this scene has several issues at once. The characters all say a line that pretty much no one can relate to. It's not really emotional as the player doesn't know enough about the characters. You just happen to get helped by a bunch of characters that you don't even know except for their names. If you just heard the lines without the characters' faces or voices, chances are that you wouldn't even be able to point out who it is. They also tried to bring another climax at one point, and failed horribly, with one exception. After fighting the Blights of Ganon, the freedom of the champion spirits was meant to be that last relieving moment. The moment that was meant to show the player that after 100 years of pain and suffering, they finally made it back for one last glimpse of the world before vanishing. However, this emotion never gets delivered properly, as hardly anything is known about the champions, except for Mipha. If you pay attention to what people think about the champions, one stands out: Mipha. She gets introduced the most to the player as she is pretty much the only one with a longer story and a relationship to Link. After defeating Waterblight Ganon, her spirit is free. Her appearance, along with her theme and the information that is known about the character, makes this probably one of the most emotional appearances in the game. This is followed by her expressing a wish to see her father one last time, and that she's sorry that she made him worry.
This only works as Mipha is properly introduced, and this cutscene works very well with her caring personality. The other champions also act according to their personalities at the end of the fights. However, hardly anything is known about them, so this climax feels more like an attempt of, we tried, but kinda lost interest after a while. So what could Nintendo have done in order to make the story feel better? Like we said before, Nintendo had all the tools. One possibility could have been to show each of the champions fighting on the divine beasts for their lives, as the calamities land the fatal blow. Playing such a cutscene as the player enters the Calamity Ganon fight would have given the fight much more of a meaning. But it's not like Nintendo didn't try to go for something like this. In one of the cutscenes, Zelda cries about the death of the champions and it all being her fault. But this is so far away from the final fight that it hardly feels necessary at all. Actually, the player doesn't even have a story-driven incentive to defeat Ganon. He doesn't know anything about Hyrule, nothing about the castle or the citizens of Hyrule. They could have included a cutscene showing the princess being happy at a festival in Hyrule itself, maybe dancing, just to show that the Great Calamity had destroyed which could never come back. All this missing information makes the last fight almost feel meaningless. It doesn't entirely miss out on everything though, as Zelda's study and Hyrule itself tell a great amount of the story just by existing already, but it's just not enough. Except for what Zelda had to go through, no cutscene talks about the pain the characters and the champions were in. All this, plus the fact that there is no plot twist and no big turn at the end, make it feel like the only thing you fought for is a destroyed city that no one knows anything about. You didn't avenge anyone, and on top of that, the last fight felt as meaningless as ever. The entire story of the game just builds up, and up, and up, and up, and then just falls apart, leaving you with the pieces. It is a little sad regarding that they actually brought in voice acting and made all the efforts to tell a good story and then ended up with rather generic characters and I feel like a lot just went untold. However, they can still save it, and we are hoping for a good story completion with a DLC coming this winter. Regardless of all the flaws the story had, the game is amazing and the gameplay almost feels flawless. And this is what Zelda is mostly about after all. Thank you for watching this week's video on the minor downsides of the story of Breath of the Wild. If you liked it and want to see more content every week, make sure to subscribe, or click the videos for some beta and scrapped content in other games.